We just finished legislative session, or at least the regular session. This particular time, I believe there was something over 8,300 proposed bills for this particular session, which I believe is a record for our state. So more bills proposed this regular session than anything else. The state came into this with an anticipated $32 billion surplus in budgets. We were hoping, or a lot of people were hoping, that that would translate to more money for schools. Maybe in some ways we got a bit more, but there's still a lot of appropriations that have not been completed. The legislature got sidetracked on a few things you may have heard about. The Attorney General was recently impeached, and the House also expelled a member or suspended a member who was deciding to do inappropriate things with a 19-year-old legislative aide. And so that particular individual was told, we're not going to keep you in the House of Representatives anymore. So yeah, there was some extracurricular stuff going on that the session was dealing with. And so that $32 billion in excess funding potentially, or our budget surplus, was not completely discussed during this particular session. But don't despair, the governor has already called a special session. That is where we anticipate more bills potentially being discussed, dealing specifically with school funding. There were bills passed talking about increasing teacher pay or making more money available to schools to increase teacher pay. That didn't make it through because the legislature was talking about other things. We anticipate that coming up. And then just other general appropriations for schools as well. So, fingers crossed, maybe school finance will become an issue that comes up more in the special session. There is a chance that we may wind up with more than one special session. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen there, but we know that at some point here in the next little while, our legislators will be back to surprise us with more exciting things of what they decide to do. Another issue that we anticipate being a major point of discussion in special session is going to be school choice. There was a bill that passed the House but didn't make it to the Senate. Essentially trying to find ways to create education savings account or some variation thereof where dollars follow students rather than going directly to schools, where the state can pay parents or the state can give allotments to parents, and those parents can then turn around and spend that money however they would like with respect to education, which could include sending their children to private school, even if it's a religious private school, or homeschooling or online schooling or whatever the case may be. So that voucher or school choice stuff, that is also something that we anticipate being brought up during the special sessions. So we'll have to see what happens there. There is, of course, a bigger push for parent rights in today's political climate. You may have noticed that in some of your board meetings. If you've had increased parent participation, we know we've seen a lot of that. And we have seen a lot more parents decide, we want to run the school, which I don't really understand because they don't know what it means to run a school. If they saw the things y'all dealt with, they might decide to go a different way on that. But anyway, so yeah, we're still expecting more to potentially come out with respect to school choice, school funding, appropriations, and then just parent rights in general. That is certainly one of the hot button issues. We'll talk a little bit about curriculum materials and library books and all that kind of fun stuff. So the culture wars are definitely here. They're impacting our schools, they're impacting the legislature, and we're all just kind of sitting here waiting for the state to kind of tell us what it is we need to do. I know that all you really want to do is educate your kids and forget all this other nonsense that the legislature says is going on, but they're the ones who give us the money, so they're kind of important to us in a lot of ways. So, all right, first one here, our state budget, this House Bill 1. As I mentioned, we did have a rather large surplus for the state budget, this $32 billion. Technically under this, funding for education has gone down from what it was the last biennium. Again, special session, we anticipate more funding, potentially, hopefully, maybe, it'll be nice to be able to get a little bit more, especially with all the new requirements coming up for school safety requirements and what we need to do for our facilities to have safe schools. So again, fingers crossed, we will get more money attributed or allocated to the public school system. A lot of stuff was going on to kind of restructuring, and I'm not a finance major, so I don't understand everything they do with the budget, but kind of restructuring some ways that public school districts can do their property taxes and how those are allocated, those type of things. Again, teacher pay, increasing teacher pay. There were some measures passed that would allow for increasing teacher pay throughout the state. We're allocating about $4 billion for more pay. but there was never actually any allocation of those funds in legislation. So no funds were actually committed for that. And so it's like, yeah, we're going to raise teacher pay, but we're not, we're going to say we're going to raise it in paper, but we're not actually going to do anything to help schools raise teacher pay. So we're still kind of waiting to see if there's an authorization or any allocations from the state to actually help that pay increase come into play. I don't know if y'all have heard, but it's difficult to find teachers nowadays, very difficult. And so if we have to let people go, it is increasingly difficult to find people to come back in, or at least qualified, competent people that we trust to be with our kids. It's very difficult to find that. In some ways, it's not a fun time to be a teacher because there's all this extra stuff you get to deal with. But at the same time, financially speaking, we know that teachers are underpaid, educators need more. But there are more opportunities for teachers to earn more than they probably would have a few years ago, just because there is such a high market and a competitive market. Especially when we look at special education teachers and things like that. That is an incredibly difficult thing to try and fill nowadays. So yes, it would be wonderful if the state would realize, hey, we've got a teacher shortage. It's hard to find qualified people. It's hard to find the money to pay qualified people. So let's give our schools some help to get extra funds. But again, they're focused on library books and bathroom access and things like that. So they're not really seem to care too much about taking care of the adults. Okay. There are going to be some new changes as far as instructional material programs. The state always comes up with new ways to develop different types of curriculum materials. This is kind of an initiative to create some open source materials, some more electronic materials, things like that that could be developed and then shared with schools as part of this as well, or as part of this bill. Curriculum publishers are going to be required to, back up one second before I get to there. The state's going to create this instructional materials parent portal, and curriculum publishers are going to be required to make their curriculum available on that parent portal. And parents are going to have the right, or should have the right, to get online, access that portal, and access whatever curriculum their particular school happens to be using. That needs to be available to them throughout the school year, starting at least 30 days before the actual first day of school and continuing on until at least 30 days after the last day of school. And so once more, parent rights, big push. I don't know why a parent won't want to look at our curriculum. They're not going to know what the TEKS are. They're not going to understand what that stuff is. But apparently parents, everybody wants to check and make sure we're not teaching LGBTQ stuff. And we, heaven forbid, we mention the fact that America has not always been fair to certain minorities and things like that. And so one of those deals where certain parents want to make sure that we're teaching nothing more than reading, writing, arithmetic. Let's not talk history. Let's not talk current events. All that kind of fun stuff. And so this will be a way for parents to somehow check us. There will be some sort of a mechanism where parents can try to challenge curriculum somehow. I'm not sure how that's going to work or what it will look like, but almost like a complaint process where maybe they go to TEA or the State Board of Education, SBOE, and somehow say this curriculum is inappropriate. TEA to look at, I don't know what that's going to look like. But again, parent rights, parents more involved. Yay, that's great, isn't it? I mean, we've always thought, no, seriously though, but we've always thought we want parents to be involved more, right? We need parent involvement. We need that partnership. Well, now we're getting that parent involvement. And we're like, oh, bleep, what have we done? Here these parents are. The ones that are getting involved may be the ones that we may not really want to be expressing their opinions all the time. Yes?
Do you know, maybe you don't know at this point, is it going to be required that all curriculum be posted on this site?
I believe that's the intent, yeah. Any curriculum publisher in the state, yeah, I believe, or the publisher. And so yeah, if we license the curriculum for somebody else or any curriculum providers or developers, yeah, so I think that's the intent, is whatever school, whatever you get your curriculum from, that is supposed to be available online somewhere. Let's see. Oh, there's also going to be a requirement now, districts, we always have our districts and charters, we're always supposed to report back to TEA on the instructional materials we use. We know that's just a thing because they want to make sure that we're using materials that align with the TEKS and that we're not off teaching creationism or whatever things are out there as well. So we've always had to do that, or we have for a long time. But in addition to that, now there's going to be a requirement that we certify that through our curriculum materials, we are protecting children from harmful or obscene content. And so that's something else we'll talk about later, this push to protect children, make sure they never see anything of an adult nature, things like that. So just an additional certification. We know that when y'all do your annual governance reports, You come to your meetings and you got certification this, certification that, and superintendent signing this and signing that and certifying all these things that the school is doing to comply. And this is just going to be an additional one where we have to say that, yeah, we're not letting our students be exposed to harmful or obscene materials, whatever those particular terms mean. I guess harmful and obscene will change depending on who happens to be in control of the legislature. So we're kind of waiting to see more about what that certification will look like. Okay. When it comes to charter schools, we did actually get some help with respect to expansion amendments. Previously, or at least the current law, tells us that if we are going to be submitting an expansion amendment, we are not supposed to submit that amendment request more than 18 months before the proposed effective date of the amendment, which doesn't give us more time. If you're wanting to open a new campus or build a new school, if you only have 18 months, you have to get approval 18 months out. Are you going to be able to secure financing for 18 months? Are you going to be able to be sure that if you're doing a new build, are you going to be able to build a school in 18 months and actually satisfy all the facility requirements and safety requirements? If you're having to go through and retrofit an existing building, are you going to have enough time in 18 months to be able to do that? That's a very, very, very short turnaround time. And I don't know why they said it 18 months initially. I guess they must just live in a world where they don't care about, actual things that schools need to do to get facilities ready or whatever the case may be. But now through this HB 2102, we have some extra time built in. And so now we can submit those requests for a new campus or a new school up to 36 months before the anticipated open date, which hopefully will be much more workable on the financing side and then also on the construction side as well to make sure that we can have a safe and secure building like the state wants us to have and be able to find ways to pay for it and not have to be scrambling to figure all that stuff out before we have to go into play. So again, 36 months, much, much better, hopefully much more workable for y'all than the current system, which is 18 months. There's a lot of writing on this particular one, but this HB 1707 was a big one for our charters as well. Well, some of y'all in the Dallas area, you may have heard that the city doesn't really cooperate with charters so much. And sometimes we've heard there's difficulties in getting zoning approvals and things like that to open new schools. Yeah, exactly. No, that never happens, right? I mean, imagine that. Everybody gets, city government and schools, charters, kumbaya, everybody's happy, perfect relationships all the time. Not so much. Well, this particular bill is finally will hopefully get rid of that and make it so that our cities, our zoning permitting people, they will be required to treat charter schools the same as a school district when it comes to wanting to find new locations or get permitting in order to open a new school. So again, fingers crossed, hopefully that will actually be recognized by our local zoning authorities. They will understand that, hey, we're public schools, we're here to help, we're here to do a community service and help the kids in these areas. And so they will not just arbitrarily decide we don't want any more charter schools around here. And so we're either just going to outright deny you permits or we're going to drag the process out so long that you just simply give up and go away because you cannot continue to wait forever and ever and ever to get zoning approvals. So this bill, hopefully a major win. Hopefully our zoning authorities pay attention to it, but it should give us the ability to actually be treated like other public schools when it comes to finding or looking to open up new facilities in new locations. The bill also does tell us that charter schools do not have the authority to exercise eminent domain. So we know that the state or a school district, like if they need a piece of property and the owner does not want to sell, well, they can try a condemnation proceeding where they can come in and say, hey, look, we're the state. We need this property to do public service X, Y, or Z. And so here's 50 cents on the dollar for what your property is worth, and you're going to be happy with that, and we're going to take your property. Well, charters don't have that authority. We can be treated like a school district for purposes of getting permits and stuff like that, but we can't exercise all powers that a traditional school district could do with respect to acquiring property. Okay. Another one that we have here, Senate Bill 763. This is going to allow schools to employ or allow volunteer chaplains to perform duties of a school counselor. And so this was another kind of a culture war bill. That we often hear on the news. Certain folks on one side of the aisle may say that, we never had problems in school until we kicked God out of school. And so now this is the opportunity for those particular legislatures to try to correct that in their eyes. And so we will have the flexibility, if we feel so inclined, to either employ or have volunteers come in, chaplains come in on an employment or a volunteer basis to perform counseling services for our students. These individuals do not need to be certified through SBEC or through the State Board of Educator Certification. We know that districts, if you're going to have a counselor, they need to be certified under Chapter 21. As charters, we're not required to have certified counselors, but a lot of schools or charters will do that anyway, just because it can be sometimes nice to have somebody who knows what they're doing and that kind of fun stuff. Yes, sir.
I'm curious, how do they define chaplain?
We're still kind of waiting to see exactly what that definition is going to look like or how it will be implemented. But yeah, it's a faith leader of some sort. I don't know exactly how we're going to make that decision, but it is, yeah. So we're still kind of waiting on clarification of that. And we can use funds that generally would have been earmarked for school safety and security in order to pay for the services of these chaplains if we see necessary. I don't know how workable that's going to be just because of the significant costs of like physical security upgrades and all that kind of fun stuff to be able to divert money from facilities to paying for chaplains. But if you want to do it, you can certainly do that. One other thing on here that, of course, if we're going to have a chaplain come in and meet with our students, they're still going to have to go through background checks, all that kind of fun stuff. So we would, whether it's a volunteer or an employee chaplain, they're going to need to be able to satisfy our standard background checks. Sorry, yes, here then, Tony.
My understanding is the board has to take action on this regardless of your decision.
Yes, yeah, we need to. So yes, y'all will be in the near future at least telling the school, telling the superintendent whether you want to allow these chaplains on campus or not. So yes, that will be something that you will all be doing. Was that it, Tony? Or okay, all right. All right. Okay, HB 3, massive bill. This one I think is close to 45 or 50 pages printed out altogether, so it's a massive bill. We're still trying to slog our way through it and see what all is in there. But some of the big stuff that in there does deal with school safety. This particular bill imposes requirements for armed security officers. And so you as a board, you are going to be determining the number of armed security officers you need to have at each campus. This is not for your district or for your school. This is going to be for each campus that you operate. The default is at least one armed security officer at each campus. If your board decides we need more than that, you can do that. Now, is there an extra funding mechanism for these armed security guards in this bill? Well, there's a little bit. Maybe you'll get like an extra 20 cents per student. Congratulations, if you got that, that's not going to pay for those services. And I believe there's something along the lines of a $15,000 per campus allotment for school safety and security that can be used for this. But again, are you going to be able to employ a full-time armed security officer for $15,000 to be at the school for every school day for 9 months of the year? Probably not. So how this is going to work is going to be very interesting to see how we need to start moving that money around. I probably shouldn't say moving money around when we got our finance guru in here based on our presentation, but again, we need to find ways that we can allocate that money and move it around in a legal way. Sorry, yes?
So they said the other part, the caveat is that boards can determine an alternative.
Yes.
But what is that alternative?
Good luck.
It's another unfunded
Yes.
mandate.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the alternative is essentially we decide we simply don't have the money, and so our board is going to say we're not going to have armed security on our campuses. And good luck explaining that to your parents in a board meeting, right? Like, school safety is important, but we simply don't have the money to pay for an armed security guard. So those are the options, to figure out how we're going to do it. If it's an alternative, what's that going to look like? Or is our board going to come out and just say, we're not going to have armed security at our campuses and risk whatever political fallout or parent fallout we get in those instances? Yes?
Is the $15,000 a one-time or an annual?
I'd have to go back and double check on that one. I don't remember the particular funding mechanism there. Yes?
So when it says may include a school marshal or other armed staff member,
Yeah.
are they talking about the Guardian program, or could it just be somebody who's licensed to carry and they're armed?
Yeah, it's licensed to carry an arm plus additional training. They have to go through some additional training. So I guess those could be the other alternatives. If we can't get an employee who's a full-time armed security guard, or whatever, we can look at a school marshal. So we can, have one of our staff members, again, somebody who has a firearms license, but satisfies some additional training requirements that I believe are going to be pretty hefty on appropriate carrying of a weapon at school. You know, we're not going to be spinning it in our fingers and doing, you know, to students and stuff like that. So we make sure that they know how to appropriately have that firearm, how to store it, all that kind of fun stuff. Let's see. So yeah, we can do armed security officers. We can have school peace officers. So some schools or some charters have actually started police departments. That could be a potential option. However, now with the requirement to have one person at each campus, you know, some charters have a single police, I guess like a chief or a single police officer who covers the entire district. Well, that's not going to necessarily work now since we are supposed to have one armed person at each campus, and so your PD may need to be more than one person. Or we can look at those, getting a commissioned peace officer to come in, or maybe an MOU with our local police departments where we have like the school resource officer, the SRO, who's a full-time employee at the local PD, but they're assigned to our school, that type of stuff. So yeah, so there could be some options there. Those school marshals, school employees who go through and complete those more rigorous training requirements for carrying a firearm on school. A lot of us, or a lot of schools, have engaged the services of consultants to help us out with school safety. We know especially with developing, oh, sorry, yes, go ahead.
So how does it define campus? So like we're K-12 at Mesquite, but we have 3 different buildings all on the same lot, but it's just one campus number. So does that equal 3?
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see how TEA says that. I mean, I don't know if it's going to be each individual building, like each separate building, or if it will be just one per campus ID number. Because yeah, we do have several schools where you have one building for your lower grades, and another building for your upper school grades or whatever. So yeah, we're waiting to see what that's going to look like as far as whether that's per separate building or just per campus ID number.
Does the security officer have to be a peace officer?
That's not 100% clear on this. Currently, the way the law is written, if we're going to have armed security on campus, they technically should be a commissioned peace officer. There's ways, though, that if we go like the resource officer route, or not resource officer, but do like the school marshal or another school employee, those individuals would not have to be a licensed peace officer. But again, licensed to carry, and then also go through some pretty strict training requirements as well. So some things there. All right, so again, consulting services. We know that, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm in law enforcement myself.
Yeah.
And there is a difference between commissioned officers versus a licensed peace officer.
Yes.
Now, with it being a commissioned security officer, would that disqualify you? Will that individual then from being able to be stationed at one of the campuses, or will it actually have to be a licensed peace officer?
I don't know that, again, currently, I believe everyone who carries a handgun or carries a weapon or carries a firearm on campus should be a commissioned peace officer. So not like a private security firm who's not. So somebody through TCLOS, is it TCLOS? Is that the law enforcement one? TCOL, sorry, TCLOS, no, sorry, Sorry, I get all those acronyms, I can't keep track. But yeah, so technically now, if you're going to have a firearm on campus, you should be a licensed commissioned peace officer, not a private security guard necessarily. But under this particular bill, I think that will be loosened a bit, and so maybe we could get agreements with, you know, other licensed security organizations. But again, we're still waiting to see exactly what that's going to look like, because there's still wiggle room as far as what this is going to be. But they've got to give us some kind of grace, because we're not going to be able to find commissioned peace officers for every single campus that we operate throughout the state of Texas. And again, this is not just charters. This is every school, this is every public school. And we know that many ISDs have their own police forces, and so they may be fine. They've already got plenty of police officers. But some smaller districts in more rural areas, they may have 1 or 2 officers that carry or that cover the 5 or 6 campuses, things like that. So yeah, this is every public school, primary and secondary school in the state has to figure out this whole armed security officer thing. So hopefully we'll have some grace and not have to go with the actual licensed commissioned peace officer. But again, we'll see. So consulting services, we know that you often go out and consult people, especially in developing our emergency operation plans. Those things are beasts. And as board members, like, yeah, I can look at that. I'm an attorney, I can go look at those templates and then I just scratch my head and say, sure, this looks great, but how do you actually develop that thing, put it together, implement it? And so a lot of times we bring in some outside help, which is great. They're a great resource, they help us out. But moving forward, before we contract with a vendor or with a consultant for those school safety matters, we need to confirm that they are registered with the Texas School Safety Center in order to be like a qualified or a registered consultant on school safety. And so I think a lot of folks have already kind of registered, and I think most of the people we've dealt with are very reputable. They know what they're doing. But just an extra thing to remember that if we are going to bring in some outside help in developing these emergency response plans, we need to double check and make sure they've actually registered and they're approved for the Texas School Safety Center to provide those services to us. And we should be checking that before we actually sign on the dotted line and get their services. The other thing that comes along with this, where our staff are going to have to go through some more mental health training things, more emergency response, all sorts of more training about that. And then there's also going to be, there is a mandate in HB3 that tells TEA to continue going back and updating and reviewing facility standards and publishing new facility standards. We know that those have been changing. Seems like every 3 months over the past year, or at least since Uvalde, they continue to evolve and come up with more and more requirements for our facilities. Those will continue to be updated. The bill also tells the Texas School Safety Center that they are supposed to be conducting reviews as well. Like every 5 years, they kind of come up with recommendations and coordinate with TEA to come up with what these school safety standards should be. So once more, HB3 mammoth bill. This is just very much very, very high 30, 50,000 foot view because there is a lot there. And we have not had enough time to really dig into all the nitty gritty and figure everything out just yet, because this one was just approved, within the last month or so. If you're clients of ours, we are pushing out updates on these bills as we have the chance to digest them. And so if we haven't already sent little snippets on HB3 out, just be aware that we do have our little policy wonks in our office going through all this stuff. And those folks, we are pushing out updates as soon as we are able. Okay. To go along, sorry.
Another question, so what's the effective date and when will the commissioner come out with the rules?
The effective date, I believe it's effective now. I think because it passed the House and passed both houses with enough of a vote, and so I believe it's effective now. With all the different sections, there may be different official starting dates. Some bills talk about this particular section starts with the beginning of the 23-24 school years. Others will say the 24-25. And so it really depends on each individual section that's in the bill and whether or not there's a different effective date for those bills. When the legislature tells TEA or tells the commissioner, publish updated standards, we're at their mercy, essentially. For the discipline part I talked about this morning, I talked about the updates to David's Law, again in the 2021 legislative session, where the legislature told TEA put out those minimum standards for bullying prevention. That took them until like January, February of this year. And so that was nearly 2 years after the 2021 legislative session ended before those rules were put into place. And so it just comes down to what TEA has the capacity to do, what their internal mandates are as far as list of priorities. But for things like school safety, I don't think we're going to be waiting for years on that. And that's such a hot button issue that I think that's one of their main priorities is to push that stuff out. And they did recently, just in the past couple of months, issue some new updated standards for facilities. And so they've been doing that on a regular basis. So a very long-winded way of saying that you never know. The effective dates depend on exactly what the legislation says. Each individual section of the bill can have different effective dates. And then when the state says, TEA do this, it's just, lick your finger, hold in the air, and see which way the wind is blowing and see when it might come out. Okay. All right, let's see, Senate Bill 838. This is a requirement that each of our classrooms, we know that for the most part, hopefully we have some sort of panic alert device, at least by the front door or by your front entrance where your registrars or your front office staff. If there is an emergency, they can flip that switch or press that button and notify law enforcement or first responders. This particular bill is now going to require all of our public schools to have those panic alert devices in each individual classroom. I don't believe there is a set funding mechanism for this bill. So this is another one where it's like, how are we going to pay for those things? Because that's going to get expensive. But for this particular bill, this is one where we do know this particular bill applies beginning with the 2025 to 2026 school year. So we do have some grace periods in there. But,
Are cell phones allowed in, so we have Raptor.
Mm-hmm.
Are cell phones allowed to be used as in this?
I'd have to go back and check the reading. I believe this is supposed to be a separate device, like just another, I don't remember if it's a portable device. I think it's something that's actually contained in the classroom that can be used. But we'll have to check and see what that looks like. I know that could be helpful because a lot of schools are using cell phones or having those different programs that they can do that. But this may be a separate device that needs to be on the teacher's desk somewhere or something else that can be triggered. But we'll check on that one as well. But again, this one, it mentions effective date 2025, 2026 school year, so there is some grace period there. But guess what? You got your parents coming in and saying, hey, the law says you've got to have panic alert buttons in all our schools or in all your classrooms. Are they going to like hearing, well, give us 3 years? No, they're going to be like, no, the law says you got to have these things. And so this could be a priority again where we start looking at trying to get those done a little bit sooner rather than later, if we can move that money around legally and find a way to pay for that. Okay. School marshals, I guess kind of going back to this, HB 3623 allows districts and charter schools to enter into MOUs or kind of interlocal type agreements with other school systems where maybe you're going to share a school resource officer. And so that could be something where if you don't have the capacity to, employ your own security guards or own security forces, things like that, or if you want to have a school resource officer in addition to somebody who's there carrying a firearm on campus, maybe you want to have another person who's not carrying at school, this just gives a mechanism for you to partner with other school systems in the local area where you can share those resources and potentially looking at, pooling your funds to be able to maybe hire better candidates or things like that to come in and work with your school. Okay. Let's see, this one, just kind of threw it in here because it's going to kind of change the way where sometimes it can be difficult for your high school facilities to get the city to actually agree to put a crossing guard or a stoplight in front of your buildings. I know that we've had some schools, or I've read some news reports of some clients down in the Austin area, in some of the more developing things, not Austin proper, but kind of out in the hinterlands, where you just got all those 60-mile-an-hour highways, and schools are built there, and staff members have been hit by cars walking across the street because the city won't install a cross guard or things like that. This particular bill just says that, hey, if you got a high school administrator, they go to the city and they say, we need a crossing guard, or not a crossing guard, but we need like a crosswalk or some sort of school zone type thing. They're supposed to work with us a lot more and help us out there so that we can help ensure safety of folks that are trying to cross the street or take care of kids who are walking on the sidewalk around school. This is not going to apply, though, if we are looking to build a new campus. So that this is not going to get around the normal process we have to go through with our traffic impact studies and our other sorts of things that we do when looking for a new facility where we talk about any sort of school zones or crosswalks or things like that. This really is more for existing schools that don't have those crosswalk areas already designated, and perhaps the city has been dragging its feet in actually authorizing those requests. So again, hopefully we'll get a bit more help and a bit more positive interaction with our folks at the cities there. Dyslexia, this has been a big push outside of the legislature. It used to be if we had students with dyslexia, we kind of had two pathways how we could serve them. We could try like through the 504 or RTI process, or we could do special education. The state has kind of pivoted on that, and so now TE has issued guidance in the past year or two essentially saying that all students suspected of having dyslexia should be funneled through the child find process under the IDEA process first to see if there's any special education eligibility. If so, we serve them through special education. If not, then we can go to Section 504 rather than trying to kind of wait, try 504 first and then see if that works, and then 2 years later try special education. But this is kind of a policy shift by the state when dealing with students suspected of having disability. And this bill just kind of clarifies that a bit as well and says, or tasks the SBOE with kind of developing or approving a specific rubric or program for testing students suspected of having dyslexia, so we have a bit more consistency in how those students are served around the state. Okay. All right, HB 1416. This is a big one for our campuses. In the last that babe's is getting to me. In the last legislative session, we had HB 4545 passed. And this was the bill that created these accelerated learning committees. And so if we had students who failed to satisfactorily perform on certain of their STAR exams or their end of course exams, we had to create these committees where we're going to come together and come up with these plans or how we're going to remediate those gaps and get them back at a satisfactory level the next time they take these STAR exams. And as part of that, we had to provide all these supplementary education services, which could include at least 30 hours per year of additional tutoring or services, whatever the case would be, to help get them or close those gaps. That's a lot. That is a lot of work to be doing with students, especially coming out of COVID. We know that's why the bill was passed, because there was the COVID gap where we realized that not everybody's ready for full-time virtual learning. And so our STAR scores in a lot of instances really kind of cratered. And so we were trying to find ways to make sure that we could catch children up or catch students up. And that 30 hours, that is a lot of stuff to be doing for our kids. There were also limits where you could have tutoring sessions at school, but the ratio there could only be, 3 students and 1 teacher. You couldn't have more than 3 kids in a tutoring group without getting permission from all the parents to say, yeah, you can have more kids there, things like that. So it was, HB 4545 was a lot, and it required a lot of extra services. HB 1416 was designed to kind of scale that back a little bit. And so now if you have students who do not perform on selected STAR exams, they will only be required to receive 15 hours of these compensatory or supplemental services rather than 30 hours, so it decreases that. The bill also increases our little tutoring size. I mentioned before it was 3 students per 1 teacher. Now it can be up to 4 students per 1 teacher for a little bit of a grace there. But again, this is kind of a bill to help reduce the amount of these supplemental services or accelerated instruction that we have to provide students. The bill also gets rid of those accelerated instruction committees, and so we will no longer be using those committees. But if we have a student who fails, I believe it's 2 or fails an exam twice, we still have to come up with some sort of an accelerated education plan, which is kind of like what we were already doing before, but we're just not going to develop it with that formal accelerated instruction team or committee. So we're still going to be coming up with a plan. It's just going to be developed through a little bit more of a streamlined process. And the current committee requirements are that, we have to include the parents on those committees under the updated bill language. We just have to give them the chance to participate, which I think we're still going to want to do that anyway, because we know that we want to have our parents involved, let them know what we're doing. But it's just going to kind of ease those, or the way that we can actually implement these accelerated instruction plans. So hopefully this will be a nice thing and a little bit of a nice win, for lack of a better phrase, for your campuses. We know that supplementary instruction got very expensive, because if you think about this, we're hiring tutors, we're bringing in extra people, we're contracting with vendors to do our tutoring, or getting online tutoring services, things like that. And for 30 hours a year for those kids, that could get expensive. Again, now we're going to be down to 15 hours per year. All right, HB 1225. This is just a way where the state's going to set kind of a cap. At least 3% of our students, upon parent request, can elect to take a state assessment in paper format. We know the state is very much moving towards a computer-based or online-based assessment system. But if certain parents want their children to take it in paper format, they can do so. If we end up getting more requests for paper tests, if we start to exceed that 3% cap at our campus, we're just going to do it in the order that the requests were received until we get to that 3%, and then everybody else, it's like, sorry, no more paper testing. Your child's going to be doing the online version of the assessment. And also for this particular one, if an ARD committee determines that a special education student, needs to take a paper format, those students are not going to count towards that 3% cap. We're not going to include those special education students there. SB 2124, we're going to develop kind of this advanced math program for middle school students in order to help them to take Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. Under this particular bill, there's going to be thresholds set where we can automatically look to enroll certain students in this accelerated math program. But parents are going to have a right to come back and say, no, I don't want my child to be in that accelerated program, which nowadays, I don't know, I would hope a parent wouldn't do that. I struggled at math greatly. That's why I'm an attorney. I do words, not numbers. But if I could have had a program like this to be a little bit more advanced in math, that would have been very helpful. So again, just opportunities we can look at to create new programs to funnel certain students who do well in math at lower grades, so we can prep them to get a more advanced level of instruction in math as they enter middle school and as we try to get them, or as they get ready to exit middle school and come into high school. HB 3803, repeating grades. Currently, I believe parents of students in grades K through 3 are able to request or require their student to repeat the grade level from the previous year. This one is going to expand that now, so parents in grades 1 through 8, parents are able to elect for a child to repeat the grade level they completed in the previous year. And that will also be offered to high school students as well, where parents can request that a student in high school retake a particular class that they took the previous year. So again, expanded. This was another kind of post-COVID thing that came out in the 2021 session where we said parents, more parent rights. If you want your kid to stay in school longer, more power to you, let them repeat, all that kind of fun stuff. And so that's being expanded a little bit again now this year to apply to essentially the entire range of our grade levels. The only thing is, if we have a high school student that the school has determined has satisfied requirements to graduate, we're not going to let the parent come back and say, no, I want my kid to come back and retake all these classes so they can spend an extra year as a senior. I know that's not going to happen. If the school says you satisfy graduation requirements, you're going to graduate. You're not going to continue on with this just because you like, I don't know, you're Matthew McConaughey. I don't know. You just like being in high school, whatever that movie was. So yeah, we're not going to do that for our seniors who are ready to graduate. SB 2294, this is going to create an opportunity, this new Texas First Early High School Completion Program. That's going to apply to students in both ISDs and charter schools. So again, just a way where students may have some opportunities to graduate early. And if a student happens to be in that program as a charter school, we're going to need to recognize that and allow them to do that. Trying to get through these. When it comes to dropout recovery programs, if your particular charter happens to be a dropout recovery school, this bill is going to give you flexibility to partner with some private or public community-based programs to help you get those dropout recovery things going and that type of stuff. So just more collaboration, more options for you to collaborate with community resources or private resources to try and get those kids the help they need in order to make those credits and hopefully graduate or get their GED or things like that. All right, school library standards, the real fun stuff. This is what our legislature decided to spend a lot of time on because we got to make sure that kids are protected in libraries, all that kind of fun stuff. So this particular bill, HB 900, is going to require our state Library and Archives Commission to develop standards for school library collections, not commissions, so standards for what can be included in a school library. Those particular standards are going to apply to school districts only, at least under this bill. It does not mention library standards for charter schools, and that's because not every charter school has an actual school library. Some classrooms or teachers may have little libraries, things like that, but a lot of charters, the smaller ones, don't have a full-blown school library. And so this particular bill says, hey, the state's going to come up with these standards for what should or should not be included in a school library, but those standards will apply only to districts, technically. Now, if you happen to have a library, do you think your parents are going to be happy if you say you're not going to comply with state standards? Well, they may not be. So that could be something for y'all to consider as boards as to whether or not you want to adopt those standards for your internal use. But we would need to see what those standards are first and exactly what the State Library and Archives Commission says is or is not appropriate for students before we make that decision. Okay. Our school library vendors are supposed to create a rating system, and they should not be providing materials to districts or charter schools that are sexually explicit. So now we're going to start reaching into the actual publishing world and tell our vendors, our publishers, you need to start flagging any sort of sexually explicit materials that you happen to sell, and you should not be selling those materials to schools. I think there was some things floated around. I can't remember if it passed or not, so I probably shouldn't mention it, but I'm going to be reckless and do it anyway, where there was potentially going to be some avenues for people to essentially file complaints or report publishers for selling sexually explicit materials or things like that. Or there were some measures where school districts were going to be asked or charters would be asked to self-report, like keep track of all the materials or all the like a particular publisher. You would have to check their library or check their catalogs and see if they published anything that was inappropriate or sexually explicit. And if they did, you're not supposed to do business with them and you're supposed to report to everybody. So, I mean, this was a big push to try and make sure that kids aren't exposed to inappropriate things. These school books and school libraries are definitely big business nowadays. But again, for now, our vendors are going to have to do their best to make sure they're not selling us sexually explicit materials. There's going to be restrictions where if we do happen to have any sort of sexually explicit material, however that term is defined, once everything is put together, we're going to have safeguards in place where students can't check those materials out, or at least certain age groups can't check those materials out, absent parent consent or parent permission to do that. And then we would need to review any sexually relevant material. So if we do happen to offer any sort of, whether it's sex education or health or whatever, if there's some sort of sex-related topic in our books, we have to review those every couple of years and make a decision as to whether those materials are still appropriate to be available to students, things like that. So if you have a library, we're going to have to start doing more cataloging internally of that and actually checking the content of our books. We're going to have to be checking what we purchase from vendors, checking if our vendors are complying with all this kind of fun stuff. So yeah, just all sorts of exciting things with our library materials. Another thing that many schools are dealing with now, unfortunately, is fentanyl overdoses, things like that. I'm sure you've read the news or watched the news and seen students who pass away because they have adverse reactions to something they took and they happen to have a seizure or something like that at school. Well, this particular bill is designed to help address that, where we can adopt policies regarding the maintenance, administration, and disposal of any sort of opiate antagonists. That's going to generally be limited to campuses where we serve students in grades 6 through 12, or if our board decides it's appropriate, maybe we're going to have it all of our campuses. So there's going to be flexibility for y'all as a board to decide which campuses will have these opioid antagonists available. The bill has other requirements. If we're going to be administering it at school, got to make sure that our staff are trained. Of course, we'll make sure they know what they're doing, trained on recognizing a student who may be experiencing an overdose or an adverse reaction to a controlled substance, trained on, where to find our opioid antagonists. So we're going to make sure we know where to store them, where they're kept, who has access to them, make sure they're restricted so that, little happy hands of our kids can't get in there and find it and start selling it on the side. And then make sure that those staff are appropriately trained on how to actually use those opiate antagonists. So, how are we going to, where do we put the shot in? How much do we administer? Things like that. So lots of training comes into that. The bill also includes some provisions or protections. Just like if we have our school medication policy, we know that if we follow that policy, whoever at our school happens to administer the medication has immunities. Those same immunities would attach if we decide to develop or implement this particular opioid antagonist policy or procedure. Not every school is doing this. A lot of times it will depend on just geography or demographics on how big of a problem your particular community is having with drugs or these particular things, but it's an option and it may be worth looking into just so we can protect our kids and make sure that we don't have bad things happening there. Kind of tagging along with that, we can develop policies now where we can maintain and administer or dispose of medications the school maintains for purposes of responding to respiratory distress. So those would be EpiPens or other things, or perhaps some sort of, I don't know if albuterol is the right thing, or just something like that. So if the student's in respiratory distress, we may be able to find ways to actually administer medication to them. Kind of the same deal there where we can authorize certain personnel who receive training to go ahead and administer that. So it's not just, hey, any adult who happens to walk in the school, congratulations, here's our medicine packet, and you can give whatever you want to any kid. No, we need to have certain people designated. We're going to give them training, make sure that we have designated locations for those medications to be stored so they're not just, again, available for anybody who happens to want to be there. And then if we end up in a situation where we administer medication to a student at school and the parent has not let us know beforehand that the student may have some sort of respiratory issue, maybe there's asthma that has not been disclosed to us, the school is supposed to refer the family to their primary care physician so they can get it checked out. So again, hopefully we don't have repeats where we have a student go into respiratory distress at school. So if somebody has an attack that we didn't know they may have asthma or something else, we can get with the parents and say, hey, it might be a good idea for you to go and have this checked out by a professional so that we don't end up in this situation again. HB 1002 with concussion oversight teams allows us now to include chiropractors or physical therapists as members of our concussion oversight teams. Currently, the requirement, at least as far as medical professionals, we need to have at least one medical doctor on our concussion oversight team, but now we can kind of expand that to also include chiropractors or physical therapists. If we do allow that to happen, those particular individuals still have to satisfy all of the training requirements that the law sets out with respect to each individual member of our oversight teams. HB 4375, all students now, or at least in grades 7 through 12, are required to receive training on CPR. This bill expands that and says we're now going to train or give teaching to students in those particular grade levels on how to properly administer CPR as well as automated external defibrillators. I'm sure the kids are going to love that one. Like, hey, here's the paddles, here we go. This is, charge it up, charge it up. But again, this is just something that we're going to need to be including in our safety training with our students. And I know in actuality that's kind of scary to think about. We've already training our upper grade kids on, bleeding control stations and how do we put a tourniquet on and how do we do this. And so here we are again teaching our kids, our youngsters on how to provide triage or emergency response. That's just a sad commentary on the world in which we live, I guess. But again, we're going to get more details on this and what that instruction looks like how often does it need to be, how long does it need to be. That's all going to be stuff that SBOE is going to be developing and pushing out to schools. But just be aware that now we get to teach kids on how to use AEDs. Let's see, SB 2069 may not necessarily apply too much to charter or to schools, but it does kind of give us some relief in some ways. Currently, we need to have signs posted in certain areas that talk about criminal penalties for individuals who engage in human trafficking. This bill kind of reduces those a little bit and says it just gives us more options on where it is that we're going to put those postings or those signs, essentially. Okay, getting closer. Seizure management, we know that as charters, we need to have seizure management plans in place. This particular bill tells TEA they're supposed to develop a specific website dealing with matters related to seizure management and things like that. And then we can then, as the schools, be able to make those materials available to parents or be able to refer them to those sites as an additional source of information. Vision screenings, this particular bill is at least HB 1297. Is going to allow us to use computerized visual screening instruments rather than doing the typical little paper eye chart things or whatever. So again, depending on funding or what we can do to find out how to do that, I don't know how much those electronic or whatever screening things cost, probably more than a paper eye chart. But if we can find the money, we can use those. All right, getting close to the last couple ones here. We now have some specific language in our bills or in these particular bills telling us that if we're going to have a dress or a grooming policy, we are not going to be able to discriminate on the base of hair texture or any sort of protective hairstyle commonly or historically associated with race. And so, our braids, our dreadlocks, our twists, things like that, we're not, and again, hopefully none of us are doing that anyway, but just a clarification that we should not be having grooming standards that apply or that discriminate on hairstyles that are typically associated with a particular race or things like that. Or perhaps, the Native Americans who have the long hair for religious reasons, things like that. So we're not going to have discriminatory dress and grooming policies based on hair. I'm going to skip through some of these, but just be aware that there's going to be some updated requirements for how active duty members of the military are able to establish residency. We know that we want to give them flexibility because they may not always have final orders on exactly where they're going to be or know where they will be living. This particular bill gives some guidelines there. We are now going to be able to allow students to use notes from their parents as documentation for excused absences for observing religious holy days. So a student can bring a note from a parent. Hopefully they're not just forging their parent's signature, but we know that never happens. But again, just some grace there for parents who are claiming religious observances for excused absences. So new options for excused absences for career days. We know there's the opportunity to have excused absences for college visits, for high school students if they're going to do college visits. Well, now we're going to do kind of the same deal for students who go out for career days or go meet with potential employers, which is great. Hey, if you're going to get ready for the workforce, sure, we'll let you have a day or two off so you can go and meet and figure that kind of stuff out. So something there. I'm not going to talk about that now because I'm running out of time. This one, confidentiality of public school employees. If we have an employee who reports a potential threat to our threat assessment team, the identity of that employee should be kept confidential or can be kept confidential, which can be helpful in some ways. So that way, if a particular teacher happens to come to us and say, hey, Jimmy's got a gun. Well, if Jimmy doesn't have a gun and then Jimmy's parents find out that Alan said Jimmy had a gun, Jimmy's parents may not be very happy with Alan, and Alan may not want his name being publicized or being told that I made the report. So yeah, this is just a way where in some circumstances we can keep information confidential. This one, not going to talk about that. Y'all can read that later. All right, HB 2012, one of the last two or three, I think. Classrooms at public elementary, secondary schools. So we can't prohibit our teachers from displaying a poster or framed copy of the national motto in their classroom. So they can have it in God We Trust poster or placard in their classroom, and we cannot prevent them. And this is kind of like the bill about requiring us to display at least one donated In God We Trust sign or picture or whatever like that in our campuses. Well, this is now going to our classrooms where our teachers can decide to do that, and we can't tell them, no, you can't display that in your classroom. All right, and I think this is the last one. We know why everybody gets into education, it's so that you can get your own vanity license plate. But this is one of the bills that came into play where there is now going to be an opportunity where DPS can issue specialty license plates with the words Texas teacher and a education-related logo of some sort on there. So again, if you've been in the business for at least 15 years, you may be able to get yourself a specialty license plate. So that's our, we're not gonna appropriate money to give you more money, but we are going to allow you to get specialty license plates.
You mean the state's not paying for those plates?
I don't think they are, no. So, and if you're a retiree, you can also get a special retiree license plate. So, all right, so I know that's a lot, but thank you all very much. We are still trying to work through all this stuff, and we will push out more updates.